If you don't iterate, if you don't experiment, you will be left behind and someone else will overtake you in some way. Like if you point your spaceship in the wrong direction and accelerate, you aren't going to get where you want to go. A lot of globally available APIs like your Facebooks and Twitters and Stripe exist on Postman. But they said, I didn't know Postman was an Indian company.
How do you think any company should go about integrating AI with their product offering?
Users don't care about AI. Users care about, is it faster, cheaper, cost effective, is it reliable? On this is where you rethink what the role of human developers is. You can't just put AI in front of the user and say, our product is basically a UI on top of ChatGPT. This 2016 to 2019 period, suddenly every startup was complaining about how do we afford engineers now? Now the ecosystem is different.
Many SaaS founder believes that it's very difficult to continue a particular thing for 10 years because you get bored.
As long as you think you're playing to your strengths, as long as you truly think you're enjoying what you're doing, it will work out.
In the current world of AI, how do you think AI is catching up with AI developers?
In like 1960, 70, 80, there were maybe 10,000 programmers in the world. Now that has gone down so much, right? There are millions of programmers today. But the amount of stuff that you need to know to be an effective web developer today has increased 20, 30x. In 2008, it was HTML, CSS, JavaScript, you're a web developer. Now there are 20 tools you need to learn. That is just not something that you can learn in a 4-year program. But more importantly, you need to be able to learn how to learn.
I'm an 18-year-old. I don't know anything. And he wants to build something on AI. What should he learn?
For generative AI, the best practices don't exist. So what I would suggest is focus a lot on one future that we are optimistic about is the space where AI agents are the primary entities consuming.
Hi everyone, I'm your host Shivank and we are part of the 01 Network by Zerodha. Together, we intend to bring you insights from the top thinkers in the field of entrepreneurship, technology and investing.
Greetings everyone. Today we have an amazing SaaS founder which have built a company called Postman. Around 98% of the future Fortune 500 company use this platform. Not to 25 million developers use this platform, and I'm very excited to talk to him. Thanks a lot for doing this, Abhijit.
I'm happy to help and great to be part of the conversation that you have started.
So Abhijit, tell us about your college days. I know that you were talking about that you were the first batch of BITS Hyderabad. How was it? मतलब जो पहला बैच होता है, because coming from Plaksha, we joined the founding cohort. So there is always a lot of unrest among the students because buildings नहीं आई होती हैं, hostel नहीं आए होते हैं. And if you can also tell us about your first introduction to the world of softwares. How did it all happen?
Yeah, I think the software interest and overlap started maybe in my school days. So I was always interested in computers in some form. I remember in 95 or 96, we got our first computer at home. I didn't really know what to use it for, didn't even know how to open games and stuff. But I think it always interested me at some level, and I was trying to find some ways in which I could sort of work with computers, whatever that meant, right? Tried to buy a few books around web development and so on. But I think I was still young, right? Class 6, class 7, so I maybe lacked that sort of fundamental awareness about what is what. I think class 8, class 9 is when I started to re-explore that. So I just did basic programming activities at home, tried to find my way around, and I think that was what first interested me into, or brought me into this field of programming, where this way of being creative was unlocked, right? Because I never thought I was creative in the more traditional sense, but I think while learning to program, you just figure out it's a different way of expressing creativity and being able to tinker with things that you otherwise can't. So I think that was what got me started, and 11th, 12th, I knew that I wanted to do something with computers further on, so I took CS as my subject in school as well. I think post that for engineering, I was also very clear that I wanted to be computer adjacent in some way. BITS obviously had a great CS program. I think a few of my friends who had gone through BITS, they corroborated that as well. So BITS has this interesting program called like this 5-year dual degree where you get into an MSc stream, so physics, chemistry, biology, economics are the options. And after 1 year, you can add on a 4-year BE degree as well. So I got into BITS Hyderabad. Hyderabad was the newest campus that was being built. So Pilani ke baad Goa started in 2006. Hyderabad started in 2008. So got admission there. Obviously, it was still under construction. The hostels were sort of half done. We had to live in under construction buildings for maybe 3-4 months. The academic complex was also under construction. I think even there, I was able to work towards the whole software and programming world. In fact, at the end of the second year, we have this internship, 2-year internship program called PS1. practice school one. So that's where I met Abhinav, right? So I was interning with Abhinav, who's Postman CEO. So he was working in his previous startup called Bits 360, right? So I knew what Bits 360 was, but I knew that they were doing interesting work. It was close to home for me, so it was all in all domain-wise plus convenience-wise a great internship choice for me. And I think that was where I got to know Abhinav. I enjoyed working with him for that 2-month period, and we stayed in touch on and off over the next 2 years. And I think throughout that entire undergrad phase, I was sort of interested in the different CS courses that we had. Those were the 4 or 5 courses that I actually attended and found myself interested in. Campus placements, I got placed into Walmart. So Walmart had just opened their India Tech Center. I think there were about 150 odd people when I joined. And about 9 months, 10 months into that role, Abhinav reached out to me saying, this is what I'm doing with Postman. At that time, Postman was already a pretty popular free open source tool. We had around 300,000, 250,000 devs at that point using Postman.
Google Chrome पे शायद उन्होंने launch करा था.
This was on Google Chrome. So Google Chrome was good because it was sort of web-based, very easy and free distribution. So it was a good place for tools that were JavaScript built, right? Because it was just an easy stack to get started with. So Postman was an app on the Chrome store, which is where we got our first bit of adoption. And I was using Postman occasionally. Some of my friends were using Postman occasionally. But one observation was that every medium plus scale company, so Walmart, a few of my friends were at Flipkart, Amazon, Microsoft, all of these companies were undergoing a very similar transformation, wherein they were incorporating APIs more and more into their internal software development, right? APIs are essentially the interface between different pieces of software talking to each other. And I think one thing that I'll mention here is, I think 2002, Amazon, there was this famous API manifesto from Jeff Bezos, right? Where he basically issues a mandate to his engineering team saying all communication between software teams has to happen via APIs, right? There can be no shared memory, there can be no shared storage. APIs have to be defined as the only way for software components to communicate with each other. 10 to 12 years after that, we were still seeing teams struggle to figure out how to best incorporate APIs into their workflow, right? If you look at the internal tech stack of your Walmarts and Amazons and Flipkarts, there is a lot of software, right? Like for every one interaction that you do as a user, you'd go to Amazon and do one search. There are hundreds of API calls, hundreds of different components behind the scenes that need to be used. That was one problem that we saw almost universally in all companies, right? Everyone was involved in these large-scale internal projects to streamline their API workflows. And we said that this is really a vacuum in the space that Postman can solve.
There are a lot of young folks in their first year of college. They don't know what's an API, where is it used, why do we need an API? So can you break it down, let's say to an 18-year-old who has a very limited knowledge of computer science or who is just starting learning computer science?
Right, so I'll give you a simple example. You use so many apps today where you log in with Google, log in with Facebook, right? So you are going to Instagram and you can log in with Google to Instagram. Right. There are two completely different companies, right? There's Google, there's Instagram, there's Twitter, there is so many other players out there that effectively give you, the user, a seamless experience. Right? Now, you don't know that Google and Instagram are different. You know, okay, I have a Google account. So many people in the world have a Google email address. And you can use Google to sign in to Instagram. Like, what does that even mean, right? So APIs are essentially the fixed set of rules that enable communication between distinct software systems. For users, this is most obvious in consumer apps, right? So the overlap or the intersection of Google and Instagram. But a lot more of this happens internally, right? So the analogy that we used to use internally in our early investor conversations is that APIs are like an iceberg. Right? What you see over the surface of the water, which are the external APIs that are exposed to the world, that's only like
20%,
10%, 15% of it, right? Most of the APIs that exist in the world are internal to an org, right? So to extend on the Amazon example, right? You, the user, go to Amazon.com, you search for some product that you want, and for you, it's one interaction. But internally, there are so many things that happen, right? There are calls to get your shopping cart information. There are API calls to get your login information. There are calls to get what the trending product of the day is. There are calls to get, obviously, your search results. There are calls to get what the payment methods supported in your country are, right? So many internal things and many, many more have to be executed for you, the user, to see one page that you see on Google or Facebook or Amazon, right? So APIs are essentially what enable all this. I think one big technological shift that has happened over the last 20 years is what we call API first, right? So pre-API first, the way you would build software like Amazon or any company would be You would say, okay, this is what we want to build. You would build a huge piece of software, lots of code, very complex to maintain. And that has a standard limitation as the team members working on it grow past a certain point, etc. After that, you figure out after 3 years, okay, now we need to do something else with this. We have built a lot of code for this workflow, but now we need to expose it to a different team. And now you slap on an API on top of it as an afterthought. Over time, what people saw was that this need to externalize became so strong that it made sense to just build API first, which means you think of the interfaces first, you figure out the implementation, what code to write, what databases to use, you figure that part later. But you start from this, these are the abstractions that I want to expose. Some part of this will be used by my users directly. Some part of this will be used by other teams who want to build on my capability. Say you're the Amazon login team, where you're building the sign up, sign in functionality. Yes, you need to expose a UI for users to be able to enter their credentials and log in. But you also have now login into other apps so that you can pay with Amazon Pay. Right? So now your same functionality is being exposed via API for something like a Flipkart to integrate Amazon Pay into them. Right? I don't know if Flipkart has Amazon Pay, but you understand the example, right? So you don't need to expose just one way for users to use your product. There are infinitely more possibilities if an API is built. Right? So that's essentially what API is enabled, and people started incorporating this shift into how software was built over the 2002 to 2015 timeframe. So this idea of API first is something that Postman is really bullish about. Right? We feel it is a much more efficient way to build software. The sheer amount of software that can be built just increases by an order of magnitude. Right? If no APIs existed today, you as a developer would be hard pressed to build anything on your own, because you have to build sign-in, you have to build payments, you have to build auth, you have to build social.
Everything from scratch.
Everything from scratch. But now, because these APIs exist, it makes your job so much easier, right? So many more people can build what they want to do, and I think that is the true promise of APIs. That also aligns with Postman's overall vision, which is to create 100 million net new builders in the world, right? Just enabling a whole new set of people to create the software that they want. And a big part of that is just building on top of these fundamental building blocks called APIs that exist, and just make your job a whole lot easier.
Abhi, people who use Postman, whenever there is a particular set of work, we don't find any other competitor to work with mostly. And you were working in Walmart, you were in the software background. So you knew that this API thing is very unfragmented. Nobody is solving that. So how was the understanding of the insight that if we build something in this place, this would work? And how did you guys, currently more than 98% of the Fortune 500 companies uses Postman in some way or the other. How did you get your first consumers? What was the story of, setting up that flywheel to having more than 25 million developers on the platform?
What I'll start with is that we felt that there was an obvious vacuum, right? Like even the first versions of Postman started out as a scratch your own it sort of a project. 2008 to 10, if you compared the state of tooling for code versus tooling for APIs, there was a huge difference, right?
What was it?
So if you were working with code, you had repositories, you had things like GitHub there, you had things like CI/CD tools, you had code review tools, right? You had tools built to solve very specific parts of the code workflow that didn't have any understanding of the API abstraction. So there was this huge gap in terms of tooling for code versus tooling for APIs. That was the first thing that the early versions of Postman were built to solve, right? Okay, I do this workflow with APIs every day, right? If I'm a developer, I'm going to make API calls, make slight tweaks to them, change my code to adjust the API. I'm going to do that repeatedly for weeks on end till I get my API right? So now how do I build something that helps me with that workflow? So that's what Postman started with. And that, I think, resonated with a lot of developers around the world, both API developers who were building APIs or API consumers who were just trying to see, okay, what APIs does Facebook have? How do I use that API to incorporate it into my application? So I think that just found a lot of adoption among developers. And a large part of that had to do with when we sort of built that out, right? If we had been maybe 3 years too early or even 2 years too late, it would have been a very different story. I think 2012, 2013 was the time when everyone was working with APIs. There was a strong organic demand for API workflow optimization, but the state of the art was just not there, right? And that was the vacuum that I think Postman fortunately managed to fill. After that, I think one very strong trigger for growth that we looked at was this idea of API collaboration, right? So if you think about it, right, an API is an interface between two pieces of software. That necessarily means that APIs are collaborative at their very core, right? You need to have at least two people for an API to make sense, right? You have team A and team B, you have your Google and your Facebooks. There are so many people using Postman, and one signal that we got was that people were creating this out-of-product collaboration loop, right? They would export data from their Postman app, email it to their team, and ask them to import it, right? And we were like, this is obviously a feature that Postman should have. Collaboration is at the very core of how APIs work. Right. So the collaboration piece was the first truly viral sort of product hook that we started to build out, and that evolved to our first paid product offering as well, right? Our first subscription-based feature. It was initially used by small teams of anything from 3 to 10 developers, but as more and more people got into that workflow, we started seeing, as you aptly described, this idea of an API flywheel. What we mean by a flywheel is something that can spin faster the more you put into it, right? So we said that, okay, some people get into Postman by importing data. Some people get into Postman by looking at code and integrating that. Some people get into Postman by reading API documentation on a website and starting using Postman from there. And all of this was centered around our collaborative core, right? The more APIs you and your team put into Postman, the more effective it becomes for me as a consumer, right? So that was the central promise of the collaboration aspect. And with the flywheel, what we intended to do was the more we can optimize each of these entry points, API ingestion, API integration, API documentation, the more the flywheel will spin, and it essentially creates its own angular momentum, right? Like it's spinning on its own. The more value is being ingested, the more value is being given out to consumers. So even if I have never used Postman before, and I come into the Postman ecosystem today in 2024, there is a lot of value that I get because of the work that other developers have put in, right? There are so many APIs that exist. If I'm a developer at Postman, a lot of Postman APIs exist on the Postman platform. A lot of globally available APIs like your Facebooks and Twitters and Stripe exist on Postman, right? So there's a lot of value that the Postman platform already has to offer me. And I think, as you said, right, the more value we can put into that flywheel, the more organic growth that we'll see. So we saw the team sizes, the average team sizes increase from 3 to 10. 2018 is when we started having a lot of enterprise interest. Like one very common theme that we heard from enterprises was that, okay, I manage a 500-member engineering org. There are 200 devs in my company already using Postman, right? So individual developers used to start using Postman as an individual productivity tool. Then they discovered the collaborative aspect of it. They worked with Postman within their 3 to 10 member team. And this happened multiple times independently within a large org. So this would naturally lead to some information going up to the VP or the head of engineering, who would reach out to us and say, okay, there is so much Postman usage. How can Postman help me with API governance, API observability, which are enterprise concerns, right? Individual developers may not make tool choices based on this, but enterprises care a lot about API productivity, security, and so on. So that's where the next phase of our growth started, where we started having these enterprise-specific conversations. And that was very interesting for us, right? Because a lot of enterprises are not traditional software companies. Their product is not software. They are IT services companies, auto, healthcare, finance, insurance. But they have a large internal IT landscape, right? And they have evolved a lot over the last 30, 40 years, multiple acquisitions, multiple strategies, which means that there's a lot that we can do to help them streamline their internal API landscape.
Give us an example of this.
There's a lot of acquisitions. There are small regional banks. East Coast banks will be very different from West Coast banks. State regulations will be different. Federal regulations will be different. And banks have to navigate all of that. In addition, there's a stark difference between how software-first companies like your Microsoft, Amazons, and Facebooks operate, because all of them will have a very deliberate internal posture around this is how we want to build APIs. They will themselves release a lot of open source tooling to help developers. Traditional companies, non-software companies, will not do that as much. Right?
Why?
I mean, their focus was not software, right? Their objective was not helping developers get more productive. Until very recently, right? Now the focus has shifted. I think everyone thinks of their company as a software company, irrespective of your domain. Everyone is an API company. Banks are exposing APIs. But for a large part of their growth, that was not the case. I think the other thing that plays a part is acquisitions lead to a merger of many different strategies, right? So with every new acquisition that you do, which is essential for growth, it becomes slightly harder to create an effective org-wide API stance. Those are problem statements that we are trying to solve within our enterprise teams, right? How can we understand, how can we do problem discovery for enterprises in different domains at different levels of scale, and build product solutions that sort of fit their requirements. That has been sort of the growth journey, right? Individual developers, small teams, and then that happening multiple times aggregating to an enterprise. I think one other aspect for growth for us is that developers are also expanding their activities, right? So if you look at the developer ecosystem today, the pace of growth of tools is very, very high, right? New tools are coming all the time. The demand on tools is really high as well. So we are constantly trying to see whether the newest developer entering the workforce, right? Say someone is a student graduating in 2024. Does Postman fit the bill for them in terms of helping them make their first API call? What can we do to simplify that process? We also want to make sure that the most experienced developers out there continue to find Postman valuable for their advanced use cases. Right? I have very specific needs. I don't use HTTP. I use a very specific protocol. I have very stringent API documentation needs. Can Postman help me solve that? Right? So as we have grown, and this is true of any product with medium plus complexity, there's very difficult trade-off between optimizing for first-time user experience, making sure that Postman is simple to use for the 80% of users, while enabling everyone else. Even if you're the most advanced, the user with the most stringent needs, Postman should still be able to solve it for you. So being able to be user-friendly plus extensible, I think or maintaining that trade-off has been one important product challenge for us over the years, and that will only continue to be more and more important as we grow.
When Abhinav called you for the first time, would you like to come on the Postman? What was that conversation? And I'm sure there must be some dilemma inside your head कि यार मैं Walmart में अभी मैं लगाऊं. It's a MNC, and somebody is asking, my senior is asking me to join a startup. So what was that experience? What was happening in your mind during that time?
One thing that was a big differentiator for Postman for me was that there was already a lot of external validation, right? There was already, this internal awareness that I had while working with Walmart, speaking to friends and colleagues, that this was a very widespread problem, right? Everyone was doing some sort of migration activity to move from stack A to stack B, and everyone had very similar problem statements. So I think one thing that resonated about Postman for me was that choice of problem statement was very apt and very time sensitive. Right, that everyone is doing this, everyone from the smallest companies to the largest companies are in the same boat. Right? So I think that was one key factor. The other was also, I'd worked with Abhinav previously, I'd enjoyed working with him. And at some point I knew that I wanted to explore something in the startup space, right? And I think for me, all the factors just fit into place. And at the end of the day, the question for me was, if not now, then when, right? Like what else are you looking for? You have a team that you like working with, the problem statement is validated, there is some user adoption and user validation. What else are you looking for, right? So I think that sort of sealed the deal effectively. I think subsequently we were also fortunate to get a really strong founding team. I think that has made all the difference for us from 2014 till now. And I think one thing we did well early on was just stay close to users, right? Because this was one place where there are literally millions of users with almost as many different ways of approaching their API workflows. So I think one thing we did well, which we try to continue even today, was just to stay close to users, work with them, right? Because if you're talking transparently with a developer, they'll understand that you can't solve every problem that they have. Just maintaining a frank and open conversation about what your constraints are, what their constraints are, what you can solve for them. I think that openness and transparency helped us a lot in our early days and continues to do so today.
How do you stay close with users? And how has the staying close with users changed from when Postman was a very, very early stage thing? And how has it changed when Postman is valued more than $6 billion?
User validation was, I think, a really strong driver for me, right? It was, irrespective of what code you wrote or what features you built, at least in our early days, the strongest motivation for me was just talking to users and seeing even the smallest bit of validation from them, right? Saying, okay, this has helped me save some hours of my day, some minutes of my day, right? That was a very strong motivation for me early on, and I'm sure that goes for everyone else as well. And the more we saw that, the more it sort of drove that user-centric nature. In fact, 2018 June is when we had our first in-person user conference in the US, right? We had around 400, 500 people attend. I think that was one pivotal moment for me, because now for the first time you could meet your users face to face, right? Previous to that it was just interaction over email, a few Zoom calls, Google Meet calls then. But we had this team of 2 devs who had flown in from New Zealand just for one day, from New Zealand to San Francisco for like a 6-hour conference, right? And just talking to that set of users just made it a whole lot more real. So I think that's how that user centricity started, and we have tried to maintain that throughout. It's obviously harder to do now, right? We have a much wider spectrum of users, much wider set of teams who have to interact with it. But that's one thing that we try to have each team maintain to achieve product market fit and to keep product market fit, right? Because the ecosystem is changing, competitive landscape is changing. So it isn't one thing which, okay, you have hit PMF, end of story. You need to constantly iterate to make sure that you're providing more and more value, and you know what the most impactful things you can do are. And it's very easy to get into this this cocoon where you are sort of protected by your own beliefs, right? Because at some stage, when you're at 20 million users, you'll always find some validation. Whatever you want to do, you can find 5 users who agree with you, right? So it's really easy to find that. And the only way to guard against that is to be sort of true and honest about who your users are, how your product is actually doing, working close to users, iterating with them. Almost counterintuitively, as the more you grow, the more it is important, right? Because we don't want to be in a state where we end up, building something based on a whim for 3 years, and find out that now the requirements and the ecosystem has just changed so much, right? So we want to make sure that whatever new thing we try, we are always close to users, we are always iterating fast, because those were the ingredients that made us successful early on, and that's what we want to continue to maintain going forward.
Abhinav offered you a co-founder role. How was that conversation? How did you figure out, when a lot of people come together in a founding team, there are always equity splitting conversation. How was that with you? How did you figure out, ye mera role hoga, meri equity itni hogi? How was that conversation? Because there are a lot of young people who are watching it. And when these people come together, उनको नहीं पता होना चाहिए, पता होता है कि कैसे equity जाएगी, how to take that conversation, कैसे we will define roles. So all the 3 co-founders were writing a code. How did you figure out कि मेरा ये role होगा, मेरा वो होगा? Tell us, put some light on those aspects.
I think it was fairly unorganized there, right? So I think for the equity thing, I think it's going to be different for each team, right? I think you need to have an honest conversation about who has done what so far, right? What you think you bring to the table, etc. So I think that's going to be a very custom conversation. I don't think that was a very long conversation for us, right? I mean, I knew what I wanted to do. I knew the problem statement and team sounded interesting. And as long as I felt that, I was invested, I had enough skin in the game, I was good. With regard to role, I think all of us knew that, it was a very hands-on role, right? We were starting with a team of 3. And we knew what had to be done, right? We knew, okay, these are the 5 things we have to build, and this is what we can do. And I think early on, role ka itna question tha nahi, because there was simply enough to go around, right? There was enough work for everyone on all fronts. We were writing code, we were also involved in customer support, user engagement, and all of us enjoyed doing that, I think, at some level. But as the team grows, it'll, as I said, largely be a matter of choice as to these are the things that draw me, and irrespective of what anyone says, those are what you will try to do more of. So yeah, I think it's different, right? I've seen a lot of different sort of formulae work, right? Different people do different roles. But I think the one thing is, as long as you think you're playing to your strengths, as long as you truly think you're enjoying what you're doing, it'll work out, right? That's my takeaway.
You are at the forefront of software development industry. Do you think कि जो बच्चे college में हैं, these students are learning the modern software development principles, and during your time जब आप bits में पढ़ रहे थे, was there any difference between what the industry is working on and what the colleges are teaching them? And if somebody is in college, what are the things that they should focus on?
I think there is obviously a difference, and that's to a large extent intentional, right? I mean, like for me, I also like the academic side of it, right? I enjoyed the sort of fundamental CS courses, and I wouldn't give that up for anything else. But yeah, I mean, there will be a difference, right? Like there'll always be a difference between industry and what academia teaches you. I think the one thing you can do in school is just have one foot on the practical side as well, right? I think now the opportunities are a lot more compared to what they were in 2008, and what we had in 2008 was a lot more than what people had, say, 8-9 years before that. But I think now the entry barrier to learning has just gone down so much, right? I think one thing that we constantly talk about when we're talking about Postman's vision is that in like 1960, 70, 80, there were maybe 10,000 programmers in the world, right? Like the access to programming was just so, and the entry barrier was so high. Now that has gone down so much, right? There are millions of programmers today. There's just so many resources around that it's really up to you as to how you want to learn, right? What you want to do. I think there's been a lot of growth and understanding and acceptance of open source as a viable entry point, right? And I think the other thing is, one big disconnect or one big learning for me as soon as I got into Walmart was software at scale. I mean, there's simply things, new terms that exist, right? What is SOA? What is software bus, right? Like these terms, like even things like CI/CD, which now people sort of know about, that is something that I just had not heard of in college, right? So those are things that you learn, but those are sort of small, right? I think people over-index on those. I think what's more important is can you learn new things fast? Because one thing that has happened in the last 4 or 5 years, the amount of tooling, right? The amount of stuff that you need to know to be an effective web developer today has increased 20, 30x, right? In 2008, it was HTML, CSS, JavaScript, you're a web developer. Now there are 20 tools you need to learn, right? Every company has its own stack. So that is just not something that you can learn in a 4-year program, right? Like you have to make a choice as to what you want to learn. But more importantly, you need to be able to learn how to learn, if that makes sense, right? Can you look at a new library that's available, a new SDK that's available, a new API that's available, and figure out quickly smart ways to use that in whatever you're doing? I think that is the more important skill. Maybe at some level, CS fundamentals will help you with that. But I think more important is just, do you sort of keep your hands wet? Do you practice enough? And I think the more you do that, the more you stay hands-on to programming when you can. I think the easier it will be going forward in your first job, whether it's a startup or an established engineering company.
How do you keep your mind fresh? What are some tools? Throw in some tools that you use to learn and stay, at the top of your game. Throw us some names of these tools, some resources that you always, refer to.
I think one important skill is also to sort of figure out how to separate the signal from the noise, right? Because every new developer of a library or SDK or API wants to advocate, right? And we're seeing that happening now with AI, right? I think I'll speak about it from an AI lens. So the LLM ops space, right? So LLMs are large language models, which have been all the rage in the last year. So now there's this huge explosion in the space called LLM ops, which are what are the different tools you use in order to use AI effectively. How do you prompt engineer? How do you test your prompts? How do you evaluate your prompts? How do you create agents by combining different prompts together, right? So this entire space of activities is called LLM ops, LLM operations. The amount of tools that you are supposed to evaluate is crazy, right? Like if I just were to search for LLM ops tools for prompt evaluation, prompt testing, I'd get 50 results.
Give us an example while giving this, give us also a similar analogy so that students who want to learn this field can have some context.
So there are a number of open source tools plus closed source tools, right? So you have something called LangChain, which has been really popular over the last year, right? There's Llama Index, there's Prompt Layer, then there are a number of commercial tools out there as well. At Postman, with our AI team, one thing that we have tried to do is sort of maintain one track on the exploration side, but also maintain one track on the product development side, where we try not to get distracted by all of the new stuff that's happening, the latest release of LangChain, Llama Index, or any other tool. But say that this level of noise in the ecosystem will stabilize at some point, and that is the point where we really would want to invest. For now, we would just want to keep exploration on one side and product development on one side.
In the current world of AI, how do you think AI is catching up with AI developers? What have been some effect? Because we know that a lot of young folks who are just coming in early, they are just writing, they're just using some APIs, some LLM APIs and some APIs to build small products. What are some changes happening, and how do you think you're catching up with those?
So I think AI at some level is a very fundamental shift, right? I mean, AI obviously in its broader context has been around for many, many years. But speaking about the new capabilities that generative AI has brought about, I think it's a very sort of fundamental shift, right? So two analogies that I use to explain how much of a change we could see. So one is a CLI to GUI transition, right? Earlier software was only command line. You had to look up documentation or you had to use command line flags, which is what curl was, right? Like the command line tool that the first versions of Postman were meant to replace. But then when GUIs became available, what you saw was not just a translation of a command line like curl to a GUI like Postman, right? We had to create different abstractions because now we could leverage that GUI technology in different ways, right? The ways we expected users to interact with Postman changed. We just didn't have a list of 50 curl commands and you can see all of them and click, right? We had different abstractions that we created, different workflows that we created. Another example is the transition that the iPhone brought about. So the capacitive touchscreen technology, right? Like where your finger is very effective at clicking icons and swiping. Apple didn't invent that, but the one change that Apple brought about with their 2007 iPhone launch was the change in mindset of developers and users. Earlier, you had keyboard and stylus, and then, oh, my device also supports touch, right? With iPhone, that changed to touch being the primary means of interaction. And what that meant was the UX changed. Icons became bigger. Interactions like pinch to zoom came about. Common UX patterns that people were used to with a stylus changed. That start menu went away, right? So that was an impact of the technology change. With AI, I think we are yet to see that happen, right? So there's this new technology that's been unleashed. People are still trying to figure out the best ways to incorporate this into product. So one interesting thought exercise that we try to do all the time is what if the GUI were invented after generative AI, right? If Postman were being built today with the Gen AI capabilities that we have, how different would the UI look, right? Do you really need a navigation bar on the left, a bunch of nested menu items at the top? Maybe not, right? So what does that AI native UX look like, right? So I think that is going to be a key product challenge that every product that's integrating AI will have to solve for themselves. And more importantly, we think of AI as a constraint remover, right? Which means that for the last 30 years, right, everyone has been exposed to some understanding of the world, right? So you have used, right from the first solitaire game that you played to the first time you used Windows or anything else to now how we interact with smartphones. There's a certain constrained worldview, right? You know that, for example, downloading a large file takes more time than downloading a small file, right? And you just, that understanding is so native to you, right, that you will say, okay, if YouTube is playing in a lower quality when I'm on a poorer connection, it's fine, right? So there are these constraints that you have just built into your worldview over the last 20 years of using software and hardware. With AI, all those constraints could potentially be removed, right? I mean, you have this understanding of, okay, and this is what has been like taught to people in schools, that you have to be very precise with your instructions to a computer, right? That's been like how people introduce programming. Now, what if that constraint is no longer there, right? So I think it's going to be a very interesting creative challenge to formally sort of explore incorporation of AI into different product disciplines. Because what everyone is doing now, including Postman, by the way, is okay, things like autocomplete. Now, GitHub Copilot has autocomplete, Grammarly, bunch of different tools have autocomplete. Everyone will do autocomplete to sort of find their way around AI. Everyone will build better search, better recommendations. Everyone will build some sort of chat interface, right? And I think all of these are very valuable things to build. But all of them are at some level an AI layer over the GUI of yesterday. What does the AI native UX look like is the question that I'm personally very excited about to see answered in different ways over the next 2 to 3 years.
What are some other constraints that you think AI will help us remove from scratch?
So I think one thing, especially in the DevTools world, is that everyone has this understanding of I need to spend time to learn this new thing, right? If there's a new language, you have to spend time to learn it. If there's a new framework, API, new software, new GUI tool, even things like Postman, people have to spend time to learn it, right? And that's, again, a very accepted thing, right? Like if you go to any development team and try to pitch your tool, one of the first things that they'll ask is how long will it take to onboard my team? If I have to onboard my team of 500 engineers, right? So onboarding, for example, is a very ingrained thing, right? You have to learn a new language, etc. I think that's one thing that AI can really help with, right? So one short and sweet phrase that we like to use with AI is that it can help reduce the distance between user intent and execution. If you know you want to do something, for example, you say, I want to build a game where my lead character can jump over obstacles. Now you have this idea, you already know what it looks like in your head, but if you don't know how to program, building that game will take maybe 6 months to a year from you. You'll have to learn how to use some basic game development kit, etc. What if you could do that in a matter of minutes, right? You could say, okay, this is what I'm thinking, maybe it's not an isometric view, it's a first person view, whatever, right? So you have some constraints, you define that. And now what can the AI world do to give you what you want, right? Reducing that intent execution gap. So I think that onboarding bit is going to be one key thing. And I think it's a lot deeper than it sounds, right? Because you can keep asking why one level up, and see how AI solves the constraints for you there, right? So with GitHub Copilot, you might say, okay, I'm going to use AI to help me write this function. But why this function? Why not go one step further, right? Why can't you use AI to create an API for you? Why do you even need to create an API? Why can't you just ask AI to do the thing for you, right? So you can keep asking ways to automate at different layers. And I think there's a huge ecosystem of products waiting to be built at all of those layers.
I'm a 18-year-old. I don't know anything. And let's apply that same level of thought process in this analogy where a student wants to learn or wants to get into the world of software engineering. And he is born post the AI world. Usko kuch bhi nahi pata hai. And he wants to build something on AI. How should he go about learning things? What should he learn? ऐसा नहीं है कि he is a software developer and अभी AI आ चुका है.
Right.
He doesn't know anything and AI is still there. And if he wants to learn computer science, software engineering, software development, how should he go about? Let's say you are answering to person in class 11th who doesn't know what's computer science. How should he go about this?
I don't think much changes, right? I think one thing that we often say internally is that for AI, the best practices are still being written. Unlike things like database architecture or like we know how to sort an array, right? It's a very established problem statement, right? For generative AI, the best practices don't exist, right? People are still trying to prove what is the best way to prompt engineer an agent, what's the best way to create, what's the best way to do autocomplete, what's the best way to do human feedback-based loops, right? So those best practices are still being established through a lot of experimentation, which means that there's no learning to do, there's only experimentation. The only thing you can do at this point is to sort of try out different things. And that in many ways is an advantage because that's where you have a lot of power over incumbents. Like there are so many things that you can do with AI today just by virtue of experimentation and iteration speed that the big players can't do, right? So that's a huge advantage at this point, right? So what I would suggest is focus a lot on experimentation, right? I don't think the fundamental principles of software change for now, right? Maybe 5 years later I'll give you a different answer. But for now, I would say as long as your basics are good, you're just enabled to experiment a lot. As I said, there is just so much evolution happening in the world of AI. There's a lot of ground for you to experiment. Not all experiments will lead to something valuable, but some of them certainly will, right? And I think that's the only sort of piece of advice I'd give, if anything, right? That there is a lot of advantage you have over the incumbents, and experimentation is the one thing that you can do much faster. So focus on that and see what are previously unsolved problems that you could solve now that you're operating in an AI native world, right? And I think a large part of this comes down to to how creative you are, right? Because without AI, you'll solve the same problems. I want to optimize the sales funnel. I want to optimize user onboarding. I want to optimize analytics for users on a website, right? Which is a very broad but also full space. With AI, you have the capability to jump into problem statements that were almost thought of as unsolvable, right? Because these constraints existed, that you have to tell a computer what to do, you need to be precise, you can't really understand human intent, the user has to click through things on your screen. Now those constraints have gone away, so I think there's a whole new set of problems that can potentially be explored. So I'm excited to see what sort of products come out in those spaces in the next few years.
What are some interesting tools which you are very passionate about, which you are experimenting these days?
So I think one thing that people will figure out at some point is this idea of prompt evaluation, which is, so if you look at deterministic software, right, where you look at a piece of code, you look at a repository or a function, and you know what it will do. That makes testing a whole lot easier, right? So you can say, these are the criteria I want my software to meet, and you can very easily write tests to ensure that those criteria are always met. With generative AI, I think that whole worldview goes for a toss, because the single biggest benefit of generative AI is what people call hallucination, right? That the whole understanding of the world that leads to creativity, that leads to different outputs each time, is at the same time a feature and a challenge, right? It is the only differentiator of generative AI, that you can expect human-like output each time with creativity, with differences. At the same time, it makes it hard to test, right? So I think there are a number of tools solving this, right? But I think that will be a very interesting space to crack, to see how prompt evaluation and testing can be done, because now all systems, all software will be expected to have some level of AI understanding. There'll be some natural language input expectation, there'll be expectation of things like autocomplete everywhere. Making sure that that piece of software works in a deterministic way, in a reliable way, maybe not deterministic, but in a reliable way, that is critical for true product adoption. AI works 85% of the time. Will you use it? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the use case, right? But you will want a certain degree of reliability from any AI-powered software. And I think that brings me to one other point, which is user trust in AI systems. So the analogy I often give here is self-driving cars, right? From a technical perspective, we are almost there, right? Like in a closed environment, self-driving cars can outperform human-driven cars. But would you trust your child's life to an AI car? Maybe, maybe not, right? What do we need to do in order to get that level of trust in something like a vehicle where literally your life could be at stake, right? Obviously, that same standard may not apply to software, but the important thing is that you need to be, like every AI product builder needs to be careful about what the current level of user trust is, how much visibility to give the user, how much to automate, and more importantly, how that evolves over time, right? Because if you remember sci-fi cartoons and movies of the 80s, 90s, there is a huge spectrum of how much AI automates, right? Some people think of AI as one robot that is smart, that can do everything, but everything else is non-AI. And the other end of the spectrum is that you only interact with AI and you don't have to move your hands and legs at all, right? So that's like the other end of the spectrum. So you need to figure out where AI fits in, where your software product fits in. And I think that goes hand in hand with this idea of prompt evaluation. So it's honestly not something we are focusing all our attention on. But as AI becomes a bigger and more important ingredient of products going forward, it will be something that needs to be solved in some way. So I'm excited to see how the tooling ecosystem around that shapes up.
So you mentioned that doubling the team size is not a direct way to double the size of work that you're doing. Why do you think this problem exists, and how do you navigate around this?
I mean, honestly, it's an unsolved problem, right? So the reason why it exists is very simple, right? That the number of effective interactions that need to happen in a team of 60 is much, much more than need to happen in a team of 30, right? There are so many more individuals that need to talk to each other. There's maybe one person in this team who can unblock you. They're out for a day now. What if you don't know that person because you haven't worked closely together, right? So the number of in-person interactions is like a factorial function, right? So it increases much, much faster than the team size. So that's like the single biggest reason why it happens. How do you mitigate that? I think we're still trying to answer that question, to be honest, because we're still in that growth phase, right? So different teams are growing. Sometimes a single product team grows, sometimes a sales team grows, sometimes a customer support team grows. And the answers are different for each of them. I think on the product and engineering side, we try to focus on strong onboarding. We try to focus on figuring out where to get resources, right? Because you're not going to know everything, but as long as you know where to find info, who to go to, it's a lot easier, right? So I think that is what we try to ensure. But I think we also realize that it's a problem that every company needs to solve for itself, right? Like every company tries to reinvent org structure. Someone will do squad, someone will come up with some other org structure model to try and optimize this exact problem.
How have you defined your org structure in order to solve this problem?
I mean, we've had to evolve a number of times over the years, right? So I think when we were less than 60 people, we had this idea of platform, services, and product, right? So platform would be like the infrastructure operating team, services would be the backend microservices, and front end would be, well, the user-facing apps. And that worked well for maybe a 1 year period. Then we said that the breadth of features in Postman has just grown so much that a single product team can't just build front end for all features, right? A single backend team can't build backend for all features. So then we separated into squads, right? Where we said that a squad is a team that has end-to-end ownership about a particular feature, whether it's the security aspect of it, or the quality aspect of it, or the documentation aspect of it, or the front-end, back-end aspect of it. So the squad model worked well, and we are still following some variant of that even today. We also had one phase where we were looking at enterprise teams differently, because we realized that in that enterprise building phase, the problem discovery cycle and product development cycle and sales cycle for enterprise was very different than what it was for non-enterprise, right? It was much longer, right? Like
what was the difference? Why is the difference?
So when you're talking to developers, right, like you have access to hundreds of developers who want to talk to you. They are largely representative of many different companies, many different org scales. The number of enterprises is just a lot fewer, right? And not everyone in an enterprise will talk to you, right? More importantly, enterprises will have much more stringent requirements. They will say, we will not buy Postman unless ABC, right? So you have to navigate those stringent requirements of all of your enterprises, and just threading the needle through that is a lot harder, right? It takes more time. It takes more time even to find the right people in an enterprise to talk to. Who is the buyer, right? Who's going to be using the product? Who's going to be paying for the product? Who's going to be making the purchasing decision, right? These are three different people in an enterprise. So I think these are the things that are unique to enterprises that we learned maybe in our first 2 to 3 years when we started engaging with them. So we had a phase where we had a different set of enterprise teams, a different set of non-enterprise product teams. And I think now we have evolved further as well. So I think there have been a number of changes to the org, each trying to optimize for and solve the problems that we saw. But it's a work in progress, right? I mean, as we grow from 600 to 700 to 1K and more, I'm sure there'll be different challenges that we face, both on the GTM team side, on the product team side. Now we are also, as I said, looking to hire more engineering roles in the US as well. So again, that's going to change how the org evolves, how those leaders hire their teams and so on. So it's going to be an interesting journey for sure.
So you started in Bangalore, right?
Yeah.
So how did the team grew? How did you decide ki, let's have an office in US, let's have a different, so what's the difference? Matlab, Abhi, what part of work happens from Bangalore? What part of work happens from States? How did you decide कि यहाँ पर हमको ऐसा आदमी चाहिए, वहाँ पर हमको वैसा आदमी चाहिए?
So 2015 we incorporated in the US because that's where our Series A round happened. And why we incorporated, we were a lot closer to customers, we were a lot closer to prospective investors, a lot closer to potential hires, especially on the sales and marketing side, right? So 2012 to 2018, there was a lot of developer talent in India, but people who had seen scale or maybe taken an org from scale 1 to scale 2, on the marketing and sales side, I think that talent was harder to find. So that was also one reason why we moved there. And just being a lot closer to your biggest customers was one big thing, right? Because we always wanted to be user-centric. So Abhinav moved there in 2015, and the GTM teams were the first teams we started to build out there. Product and engineering was largely, and even still is in India, most product development happens out of Bangalore and remote India teams. And now we're also hiring for certain key roles, where if you're looking for someone who has helped a company of our order of magnitude revenue, of our order of magnitude number of requests scale from X to 100X, right? Like those skills are very few and far between, and it's like you have to go where those people are. Now we are also opening niche engineering roles in the US as well. I think US was also a big proving ground for our GTM teams, right? So customer support. How do you do product-centric customer support, right? That was a new field essentially, right? We had to ensure that our support agents didn't simply read off of a playbook, but they were very closely involved with product development. They were one of the biggest sources for user feedback coming into product development teams. They were the ones who were involved in product development discussions. So it was a very different sort of function that we wanted to build out with customer support. The same goes for sales, marketing, etc. Right? Because as I said, with enterprises, you're facing a scenario where the user, the buyer, and the decision maker are three different people. Right? So you need to communicate with all three of them about what Postman is, what value prop Postman provides, and that requires you to be very close to the product. Right? So we wanted to build very specific types of skills in all of these three areas, which is why there was a lot of focus on hiring and growing the initial team for these three functions.
In an enterprise, how do you go about finding that this will be the user of the product, he or she will be making the payment of the product, and he or she will be the key decision maker to buy this product? How do you differentiate, and how do you actually get to those? What's the key insight there?
I think that is all about the skills of the salespeople, the sales teams, right? I think it's, at some level it's also a skill that is developed over time, right? You try to segment by scale of company, you try to segment by domain. For example, someone in a healthcare segment, they'll be obviously very justifiably concerned about security, privacy, etc. So you figure out who's looking at those concerns. You also figure out who's looking at IT productivity, right? Because in many companies, IT is sort of as a cost center, not as a product development or revenue center, right? So if it's sort of as a cost, you need to approach it differently, right? You need to figure out your pitch around how productivity is going to improve, how their top line is going to improve, how their bottom line is going to improve. So I think those are conversations that are highly org specific and domain specific, right? Like, so now we have some expertise built up when talking to someone in the insurance industry or auto industry, right? Or IT services industry. And I think that is a skill set that is highly specific to the space we are in, and an intersection of that with the domain we want to sell to, right? So I think that is something that we've built up over time. And yeah, I think we've also sort of gained a lot by the different key hires that we've made in these functions and been able to leverage their learnings from past experiences and so on.
So a lot of companies want to integrate AI into their product, and a lot of users are also bogged down with a lot of AI tools. How do you think any company should go about integrating AI with their product offering?
So I think there are two different answers to this, right? One is it user-facing AI, which is what most people think of when they think of AI. The other is what can AI do behind the scenes, right? Which is, let's say, you spend so much of your development team's bandwidth trying to debug an issue, right? There's an issue that you face, a customer reports a bug, or you see some API being unavailable for some time. How quickly can you debug that? How quickly can you, or how much can you optimize your internal response to that, right? So I think there's a large bit of conversation to be had around backend AI as well, but to focus on the user-facing AI bit, right? I think one philosophy that we try to follow is not AI first, but AI native, right? And what I mean by that is that users don't care about AI. Users care about, is my problem being solved faster, better, cheaper with lower resources, etc. Right? They don't care about AI. And I think what's very tempting to do for a lot of teams is just to throw AI at a problem. And that is often not going to give you the best results. It might give you an initial hook. It might lead to some new exciting feature that you could not build earlier. But I think you have to realize that there's a lot of products building with AI, right? So you need to make sure that you optimize on the axes that users care about. Is it faster, cheaper, cost effective? Is it reliable? Because one big problem with AI is the reliability, right? If you get different output each time, you can't just put AI in front of the user and say, our product is basically a UI on top of ChatGPT, right? Users aren't going to go for that because that they can just do themselves. So I think the key decision points for product builders are going to be, what are the things that I cannot do with code? What are the things that are impossible to do without AI? And use AI as a constraint remover, right? Because the way I think about it is that there are so many features that pre-advent of generative AI were maybe impossible because only 80 out of the 100 constraints were solved, right? But all of them were valuable features to build. Now with AI, suddenly you are pushed over the edge and those features become doable. They become implementable.
For example?
How do you parse documentation quickly, right? And this can be a large code base, it can be a large piece of documentation. Now documentation for a complex API will span into multiple pages, right? You have to look at the auth section, you have to figure out, do I call the user's endpoint or the search endpoint or the list endpoint? And there's a lot of reading that you have to do to get started. It can often take maybe half an hour till you make your first successful call. That's just the expectation that everyone has, right? API documentation writers have this expectation that users will spend 30 minutes trying to figure this out. Users have this expectation that if I have to use a new API, I have to do this half an hour work before I get my first success. Now that's one thing that AI can, I think, help resolve. If as a API consumer, you can say, I want to use the Facebook API to get a list of friends of the user, right? Do you really need to do anything more than that, right? How much can AI help you there, right? So I think all of these are very standard product ideas that people are exploring. For product builders, what this means is that you need to think of smart ways to implement this, right? LLMs are just one tool in your sandbox, but you have a differentiator, right? For Postman, for example, our differentiator is the core API domain understanding that we have. If we don't leverage that and we simply use some LLM, we are, one, opening ourselves up to competition. Two, we are not giving our users the best capabilities just because we are leaving so much on the table. We are not leveraging the data that we have. We are not leveraging the API domain expertise that Postman uniquely has. So I think what everyone needs to think about is, how do you merge that with AI capabilities that now exist, right? Because if you don't do that, you are opening yourself up to competition. You are not adding a lot of value over what users can do with AI anyway. So I think that is going to be key, right? Like for us, one big thing that we think of is that APIs and AI go hand in hand a lot. And one future that we want to see is that a lot of API consumption today is done by human developers, right? So you might go to Google API documentation, Stripe API documentation and see, okay, how do I take a payment from my users? How do I do a Google search? But one future that we are optimistic about is this space where AI agents are the primary entities consuming APIs, right? So you are building APIs. So there's a certain baseline APIs, right? Take your financial services or take your IoT-based APIs where there's some soldering that you have to do to expose data, right? So that is going to be done by humans. But then the next layer of APIs or next layer of apps can be built by AI agents, right? So now there's also maybe one conversation to be had where you rethink what the role of human developers is, right? Where human developers can solve the truly creative problems. And one analogy there that I like to think about is this idea of 3D printing for software. So if you think about what 3D printing did in the hardware world, it enabled you to create custom and cheap. Prior to that, you had two options. Either you bought something off the shelf, or you paid some fabrication studio a lot of money to build something that you want. With 3D printing, those constraints were removed, right? So you can build just two items of a particular piece shaped exactly according to the 3D design that you have. So I think AI can enable that for software, right? You don't need to use off-the-shelf software. You don't need to go to an expensive software design firm to build custom software. You can just say, this is what I want to do, and AI can build that for you given the amount of APIs that exist, right? So I think those are some interesting thought experiments that we are trying to figure out, and I'm sure that will have a significant impact on AI-enabled products of the future.
So Postman is one of the most valuable startup in the country, SaaS startup in the country. But I'm sure behind the scenes there have been some challenges which were like key defining moments in your journey. What were those, and how did you navigate around those?
I think in our early days, hiring was quite funny, right? Because a lot of the candidates that we spoke to, most of them knew about Postman, but they said, I didn't know Postman was an Indian company, right? So we faced that for a long time.
Why was this confusing?
So I think at some level there was this expectation that dev tools are just not built in India, and I think I'm happy that understanding has changed over time. But all the tools, every other tool that you use is essentially US built. So I think we faced that confusion for a while. We also,
how do you navigated that? Matlab,
I think it was slow. There was no answer apart from building awareness in India, making sure that we engage a lot. So we started a student program just to engage with universities around the country, just so that this idea of what an API is and what role Postman can play is something that people understand more broadly. And over time, that awareness has come. I mean, I think hiring is still sort of hard. I mean, every year there are new challenges, right? Like there was this 2016 to 2019 period where there was a lot of funding, right? So suddenly every startup was complaining about, how do we afford engineers now, right? During COVID, that changed. Everyone had to figure out how to hire remote. Now the ecosystem is different. So every few years, the sort of macroeconomic climate also changes, which affects how you hire and sort of how you are perceived. And that's one external factor that we need to constantly react to.
I was talking to a recent SaaS founder and he was saying that many SaaS founder believes that it's very difficult to continue a particular thing for 10 years because you get bored. How do you see that? And how do you, keep yourself excited about what you're solving?
So I think it's not one thing, right? What I'd say is that you're not doing one thing. I mean, the things that I do day to day now, I think that has changed every year for the last 9 years, right? Like my day-to-day activities have changed. Postman as a product has changed. The key challenges that the company is solving, those have changed over the years. So I would say our vision is constant. We want to create 100 million net new builders in the world. We are optimistic about the API future and what APIs mean for new developers, what APIs mean for enterprises. But the way that translates to what you do on a day-to-day basis on the ground, that changes very, very frequently, right? Like now, for example, we are working with AI. The next 2 years are going to be AI heavy. We don't know what the world will look like 2 years from now, right? We hope to have some say in it. Everyone's roles are going to evolve, right? So I think it's hard to do the same activities for even 3-4 years, I'd say, right? But as long as you have an ambitious enough vision that gives you enough maneuvering room to make sure that you are investing in the smart things, you'll always find enough variety. And maybe this is something that's specific to the software world, right? Where the pace of evolution is so rapid that you do have the opportunity to work on different things every few years to sort of recalibrate what your focus areas are. So yeah, I mean, my short answer would be that vision stays the same, but things that you do on a day-to-day basis, those have to iterate rapidly. Like you have to be reactive and ideally preemptive, to be ahead of what you're seeing in the ecosystem, right? If you're simply reactive, there's someone else who's ahead of you. So you have to constantly be agile and tweak what you're doing. So I think that helps keep all of us on our toes at all times.
As a SaaS founder, what have been some key mistakes that you have made, which you would say, if you had a chance to visit and meet 22-year-old Abhijit, what would you say? Ki yaar, ye galti mat karna because I invested a lot of time, energy and money because I committed this mistake.
The only thing that keeps you alive as a startup is your iteration speed, right? If you don't iterate, if you don't experiment, you will be left behind and someone else will overtake you in some way. Right? And we have seen this happen time and time again, Blockbuster being a very famous example. Your past success is your past success, right? Whether it was on the product side, revenue side, whatever, user engagement side. Now that gives you a boost, but does not guarantee that your future decisions will also be successful. And I think just this habit of finding PMF all the time and internalizing that to be a constant activity, that would be a huge learning, right? That no matter what you have built so far, I mean, Postman has this API client tool that is the most widely used feature of Postman. That does not guarantee that everything we build will be successful, right? So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Find your users, talk to them, and just use that to iterate fast and make sure that you aren't operating with blinders on.
How do you iterate fast?
I think not preemptively scaling, for example, right? Like just because Postman is selling some stuff to the enterprise does not mean everything that we do is enterprise ready, because growth comes with a certain level of rigidity, right? You say that, okay, this product is now built, past tense, now it can be scaled. But what if it's not built? What if you have reached just a local maxima, not a global maxima, right? Like how sure are you that this is what is something that you should put your weight behind, right? Like if you point your spaceship in the wrong direction and accelerate, you aren't going to get where you want to go.
Give us an example, give us an analogy in your journey of exactly what you're talking about. Finding the PMF and then, not preemptively scale.
I think one product that we can talk about is this thing called Postman Flows, right? So Flows was our attempt at building a visual programming tool that was centered around APIs as a fundamental building block of software. Now, we first started building flows around 2 years ago, right? And our main goal with flows was to make, as I said, software development easy. Can a non-programmer come to Postman and use the product to build the, the workflow that they want? And I think our first iteration, we just ended up overcomplicating it, right? And what we realized was that, yes, you'll get some usage, some validation. It was not as simple as we'd wanted, right? We want the product to be a whole lot simpler, a whole lot less stuff for users to learn in order for its own vision to be realized, right? So we had to go back to the drawing board, iterate a number of times until we got to a point where we saw, a different persona of users organically adopting flows, right? So I think that would be one example where maybe we built an overcomplicated product and we had to go back and what was the simplest product that we could build in order to really solve the core problem of flows, which was to enable non-programmers to build software.
Postman has north of $100 million in revenue. What are some ballpark numbers of revenue?
Revenue we generally don't talk about. So
okay.
we are upwards of 100. But yeah, I think what we're focusing more on, I mean, we think of revenue as a lagging indicator, right? So we generally want to focus on what potential do we have for the products that we are building, what are the biggest problems we are solving. Because if you look at any ideal growth graph, right? In 2030, if you ask me what is giving the most users to Postman or the most revenue to Postman, I hope it's the features that we haven't even built yet, right? So we do want to focus on problems of the future. But yeah, I think at some level you do need to be wary of the fact that revenue does have some bearing on where you are as an org, and going from 10 million to 100 million to 1 billion will have different challenges along the way, and you need to make sure that you're picking the right problems at each point.
When you have raised more than $200 million. When you raise so much of amount, where does the most resources go into?
Being a product company, we do want to have R&D at the front and center of what we do. We do want to invest a lot in research because, as I said, in 2030 terms, most of the revenue is going to come from features that we have not built yet, even from problems that we haven't identified yet. Right? So that means that we need to invest a lot on fundamental research, on problem discovery, and we hope we can do that effectively. Right? So that's always going to be our aim, to be a research focused company, so that we can really make sure that we are solving for and investing in the problems of tomorrow rather than what we have built so far and adding incremental improvements there.
So generally, we see that most of the SaaS companies have upward of 60, 70, 80% of gross margin, gross profit. But we want to understand that what's your take on profitability versus growth, and how do you think it's your way of becoming profitable? Because in SaaS, it's generally visualize that it's easier to be profitable because as a SaaS company you have high gross margins and stuff like that.
You can be profitable if you want to be, if profitability is your goal, right? But I think the vision that you started out with is necessarily going to be very ambitious, right? So you want to create 100 million net new developers, right? You want to be the API source of truth for all developers in the world, right? So that's a very ambitious vision, one that we are not close to meeting, right? There's a lot of growth still to be had. We are less concerned about profitability around what we've already built, but as I said, more about how we can best reinvest that into problems and solutions of the future, right? So, and I think that's also something that is important to align with your investors, right? And I think we've been very fortunate in that regard as well. As long as you have a very clear vision that you can articulate well, that you can convince people about, and you have a clear path to sort of understanding and realizing that, most people will be on board, right? And you obviously need to make sure that you have successes along the way, right? You can't say that we are going to operate pure research focused mode, loss making for 15 years, and after that we'll hit this, right? Like that's just not going to be, not going to be realistic. You do need to make sure that there is enough success that you can show and prove, while at the same time making sure that you are reinvesting in what you believe are going to be the things that take you to the next order of magnitude of growth and product.
But do you find some pressure in the current days when the investors says, you have to become profitable, and it's completely non-aligned with your vision of?
So it's not non-aligned. I think at some point at the end of the day, businesses have to generate profit, right? I think that is a very fundamental understanding. I think again, we've been fortunate enough to have good alignment with our investors there, that as long as they understand that we are moving in the right direction, most of the bets that we take work. As long as those criteria are met, I think everyone is going to be very encouraging and going to be understanding of the fact that these are valid bets to take in the future, and if some of these succeed, Postman will do really well.
Tell us about your favorite SaaS companies and your favorite SaaS founders that you learn a lot in India and abroad.
I think BrowserStack is one example that comes to mind, because I think one thing is they're in the developer tool space as well. We look up to them from that lens, right? Being one of the forerunners in the dev tool space. I think globally, for a long time, we were working very closely with Stripe. I mean, I was involved in our billing systems integration, and like Stripe was one company that I looked up to from a developer experience perspective, right? They were a small team when they started. They iterated really fast. They built out a lot of useful stuff. And I think the developer experience of working with Stripe, integrating with Stripe, is something I personally enjoyed quite a lot.
Who are some SaaS founders that you like to learn, love to learn from?
People who have picked ambitious problem statements. I think Stripe is certainly one that fits the bill. With AI now, there are a lot of companies that we are seeing.
For example?
So I think one company that we are looking at, obviously from a LLM point of view, is this company called Mistral, which is I think France-based, and they're a very small team, but they're competing with the likes of OpenAI and Anthropic, etc. So I think that just goes to show what a small team can really do if the team is picked correctly, if the vision is correct, if you have the right skill set. Team size is really not the biggest determinant of innovation and growth.
What has been the lowest moment in your life, and at that point, what was the best advice given to you?
So I remember I was having a chat with one of our customers, right? And they were basically at one stage higher than Postman in terms of growth. This was a few years ago. And I think one thing that they said is that the org and all its team members have to basically reinvent themselves every few years, right? And that was also at a point where Postman was going through one of its scaling inflection points. But I think just the fact that this is something that companies face and it's not unique to Postman, I think that was comforting in a way. Yeah, and it's just been something that gives you a different perspective on things because you're working, hands-on on different problem statements, but just realizing that different teams go through the same thing, and it's almost a rite of passage for you as an org. I think that was an important external perspective.
Any book that has had a lasting impact on what you do at Postman?
I think two I'll mention, none of which are related to software in any way. So one is this book called The Emperor of All Maladies, which is about the history of cancer treatment, right? And I think the biggest takeaway there was, so many things we take for granted today, especially in the world of science and technology, because that's what we are most involved with, is that there have been so many people over the last 50, 100, 200 years, depending on the field, that have given so much of their life to that, right? Take cancer treatment, for example, right? Like treatment for cancer was non-existent maybe 200 years ago, right? There was some very basic non-evidence-based approaches tried, but more importantly, as you learn about the lives of people who really made it their life's mission to solve that, and see how much better the world has come because of that, I think that was very humbling, right? And you see similar stories when you read about fundamental sciences in technology as well. I think one other example would be this biography of the Wright brothers, which I read, I think, 2 years ago. So I've always been fascinated by aviation, right? And this was a very similar theme for me, that something that all of us take for granted now, right? Just how many small and big challenges you have to go through if you're inventing something that's actually new for the world, right? How many people don't believe in you? How many logistics challenges you have to face? How do you get your plane parts from Ohio to the place where you actually want to fly, right? Like those simple challenges that many people would be thrown off by, those effectively act as things that differentiate you, right? Like if you go through all of those, you are increasing your odds of success, right? And I think those learnings at a slightly abstract level are what I would try to apply to Postman as well.
How did you meet the most important person in your life?
I think the person you spend the most time with is definitely the most important in your life. So my wife and I, we were actually in school together for the last 2 years. So she came into Modern in class 11. I think we knew each other, but we didn't really hang out. But then we were both in BITS Hyderabad together as well. So I think that's when I got to know her.
Apart from building Postman, what's on your bucket list?
I do want to do a lot of travel. At some point in life, hopefully I get that opportunity. And for me, it's, there's one life, one planet, right? Like, right. Why would you not do what you can? Right. So I think that's one. I do enjoy sort of distance running as well. So I would want to sort of focus on that at some point. And I think it's like from a lifelong perspective, it's important to be agile, flexible, etc. throughout your life. So I think that's one thing that I would want to continue to do in the years to come as well.
Perfect. Thanks a lot.